Everybody. Last time we discussed heart anatomy in more details, focusing on the chambers of the heart, blood vessels, as well as the valves to make sure that blood only moves in one direction to prevent any backflows throughout the chambers of the heart using these valves. We also talked about some of the imbalances associated with the valves of the heart, as well as the contractile force of the ability associated with blood supply to the tissues using coronary blood vessels. So right now we're going to basically completely switch gears, and we're going to actually focus on the microscopic anatomy of the heart, which focuses on more specifically focusing on the contractile unit of the muscle that gives the heart its ability to pump. So if you recall earlier in one of our earlier presentation, I mentioned a word for muscle. So we use the word, if I want to use the word muscle in a sense of vocabulary, I can either use the word myo, or so myocardium basically, or the word sarco, and both of these basically represents the word muscle. So, looking at the vocabulary associated with a cell, we can describe them specifically for the muscle using words such as myo or sarco. For instance, if I'm talking about regular plasma membrane of your cells, or in any cells in your body, I can just simply call the membrane plasmamembrane. But in the case of muscle, we refer to this as sarcolemma. We also, within the cell, we had a structure that is referred to as endoplasmic reticulum. So endo implies inside. So in the case of muscles, we can replace that with the word sarco. So we can refer to it as sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the importance of sarcoplasmic reticulum is the fact that it has a significant storage of calcium, which is extremely important for the action of muscle contraction. Now, the space within the cell is referred to as the cytoplasm, as in cell space. In the case of muscle, the cyto is replaced with sarco, so sarcoplasm is a space within the muscle cell. We mentioned calcium being stored inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, the goal of that is that it is extremely important for muscle contraction. One of the essential characteristics of a skeletal muscle is a significant number of mitochondria when compared to a normal cell. So about 25 to 35% of the cell volume is going to be mitochondria. If you recall, mitochondria is for ATP synthesis. So basically, this is extremely important for production of energy within the cell. And remember, your heart uses about 1/20th of the blood supply that is produced by and circulates in the body. So that oxygen will be used to basically produce a significant amount of energy, because basically your heart can't afford to be tired or fatigued because it's contracting 24/7 for duration of your life. We also have these extensions called T-tubules, which basically is an extension of the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane, that extend throughout the cell. It is present both in the cardiac as well as the skeletal muscle. But our goal is to focus on the cardiac muscles today. And the focus of that is to spread something called depolarization, which is part of the electrical impulses created inside a cardiac muscle cell. So some of the characteristics which we also discussed in a sense of histology early on is the shape of the cardiac muscle cell. They are short, fat, and branched. So the key word that we talked about was basically that branch structure we described, and it says this is extremely important for spreading the electrical impulses. Majority of the cardiac muscle cells have one nucleus, but they can have up to two nuclei. They have the light and dark pattern that is present in the muscle, which again, you looked at it. So if you're looking at the muscle, you see patterns like this. And those patterns are referred to as striations that is present. And also where we have one cell joining another cell, so let's say you have another cell down here and you have branching here, you have these darker lines that connect and join these cells together, and that's referred to as the intercalated discs. Basically, these are the desmosome junctions that uses the linker proteins to connect the cells together. The importance of desmosomes was to ensure that the cells basically can withstand strenuous activities and there wouldn't be any damage because the force will be spread out evenly throughout the cells. Next one is a structure called, or junctions called gap junctions. Basically, the way we describe them is just basically these are these proteins that create these pores or gaps from one cell to another, and is extremely important for communication. So when you create electrical impulse in cell number 1, let's say, you want to make sure the electrical impulse is passed to the second cell. So to do that transfer, you move ions, you move your charges from cell 1 through to cell 2 using these pores called gap junctions. Again, it allows the heart to be synchronized to make sure that your heart is beating as one unit by allowing the cell to communicate with its neighboring cell, passing the electrical impulses from one location to another. So here is looking at some more details in a sense of pictures rather than the description we provided previously. So branching of the muscle is visible here, right? What we described. The white and dark lines right here are representing your striation. Darker lines you see here are your intercalated discs, which you can also see in this picture. You have a significant number of gap junctions. You can see them here and here. That allows for electrical impulses to rapidly spread throughout the cell. And the last picture you see here is again desmosome, which are actually representation of your intercalated disc. The other thing that is mentioned, but you also do need to know it, is the T-tubules. So if this is your muscle cell surface, which is your sarcolemma, you can see it being dipped down, which form these extensions or tubules. This is going to be your T-tubules represented in the light shade of blue. And that's extremely important for spreading the electrical impulses throughout the actual muscle cell. You see it, how it dips inside. And what you see as darker blue, which basically looks like interconnected channels, these are representing your sarcoplasmic reticulum in the dark blue. And the importance of these is, again, if you guys remember, we said this is calcium storage. So calcium storage is extremely important for the functionality of the cardiac muscle, as it enables the heart muscles to contract. So looking at some of the similarities we discussed, again, in the sense of histology between the two categories of muscle, which was cardiac and skeletal muscle. Both of these muscles are contracting by using a depolarization process, which is part of the action potential. Depolarization is able to spread throughout the muscle cell, either skeletal or cardiac, using the T-tubules. Both cardiac and skeletal muscle contain a significant amount of sarcoplasmic reticulum that stores and releases calcium. And the way your muscles are contracting, both cardiac and skeletal muscle, is they have an excitation phase, which is basically depolarization, as I mentioned earlier, and contraction, basically muscle contraction. So these two are bundled up together, allowing your heart to create the pumping action. Some of the differences that are viewed between the cardiac muscle and the skeletal muscle is that they're actually in the cardiac muscle cell. This is really important, guys. In cardiac muscle cells, you actually have two types of myocytes. Myo again means muscle, cyte means cell. So myocyte basically means muscle cells. So what are these two types of cells? So the first one is referred to as the contractile cells. This is the name is kind of self-explanatory. So if I want to create muscle contraction, these are the cells that I would be relying on to create my muscle contraction. The second type of cells that I have, which is also extremely important, are referred to as the pacemaker cells. So pacemaker cells are non-contractile cells, and they're responsible for what? The process known as depolarization. So remember previously I mentioned that there are two steps, excitation followed by contraction. Okay, excitation followed by contraction. Excitation is done by what? Your cell type 2, which is your pacemaker cells. Contraction is done by cell number 1, which is the contractile cells. So they have to be working together, one exciting, the other one creating the contractile force, otherwise your heart will be non-functional. What I mentioned here says differences between cardiac and skeletal muscles is when you're looking at a skeletal muscle fiber. This is extremely important, guys. Your heart does both excitation and contraction. It has cells for excitation and contraction. Your skeletal muscle cell, okay, for the excitation, they actually rely on nervous system. But for contraction, you rely on the actual heart muscle. But for heart, you're doing both of them within the heart. So heart is another sense is independent of your nervous system when it wants to create electrical impulses or the depolarization action that causes excitation. So the other main difference is that when part of your heart contracts, when your heart is ready to contract, it contracts as a unit. It doesn't say, okay, I'm going to contract some of the muscles, then contract the other one. Cardiomyocytes, which basically means heart muscle cells, all contract as one unit, all at the same given time. Contraction of all of these cells together makes sure that your heart is pumping properly. So if you see scenarios where all of the heart muscles are not contracting at the same time, then you have major problem with circulation of the blood in the body and to your lungs, depending on the system. So in the case of cardiac cells, all the cells contract as one unit. In the case of skeletal muscles, they contract what? Independently. So think about this. When you think about skeletal muscles that are connected to your bones, you don't create the same force when you want to lift a pen versus your backpack, right? So depending on how much force you want to create, you activate more muscle units to allow you to basically carry the function. But heart, it says, if I'm going to contract as one unit. A skeletal muscle says, I'm going to only contract enough cells to create enough force to do whatever I need to do. I'm not going to waste energy. The next one that we describe is the influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid that triggers the calcium release within the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So we already talked about sarcoplasmic reticulum, basically a space where calcium is stored. Now, inside the muscle, inside the cardiac muscle cell, calcium enters the cardiac cells. Okay, calcium enters the cardiac cells. That leads to release of calcium from where? Sarcoplasmic reticulum. So basically, you first have calcium coming in from the outside into the cell, And that calcium causes the release of calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum. Skeletal muscle cells, on the other hand, has no calcium coming from the extracellular. Let me show you on the picture what I mean. So, if you're looking at this picture, this is a muscle cell, right? So, if I want to trigger sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its calcium from here, what I want to do is first bring calcium from outside to here, right? Outside to inside the cell. And when I bring that calcium, then I cause release of calcium from the blue tubes, which are sarcoplasmic reticulum, into the inside of the cell. So 2 levels of calcium, from outside into the cell, and then from sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cell. Muscle cell does not have this calcium release. Muscle cell has only this calcium release from sarcoplasmic reticulum into your actual cell. Now, the other main difference that we discuss is in a sense of the utilization of energy to create, utilization of oxygen to produce energy. So in a heart, you exclusively rely on an aerobic reaction. If you guys are not familiar with the word aerobic, aerobic means that it requires O2, so oxygen. Again, going back to what I discussed earlier, 1/20th of the energy used inside the body, 1/20th of the blood supply goes to the heart because heart requires a lot of oxygen. So cardiac muscles have so much mitochondria. Again, 25 to 30% of the mass of the cells are mitochondria. And they are much more than a skeletal muscle. So cardiac muscles are highly dependent on oxygen and cannot function without oxygen. Think about this. No oxygen, no O2 means cell die. And cell die typically translates to what? Heart attack. So if any of your blood vessels that supply oxygen to your heart are destroyed, that means, or blocked, the cells in that region die, and that basically means heart attack. Really cool fact about skeletal muscles, on the other hand, a skeletal muscle can undergo a process called fermentation when there is no oxygen available. So they can do with O2 or without O2. They're perfectly fine. Now, that being said, they can last a very long time without oxygen, but they can still survive. They won't die immediately just because they don't get oxygen. The really cool fact about cardiac, though, it is very adaptable to other sources of fuels. So it doesn't necessarily need to have glucose as a source of energy. It also can use lactic acid, but it has to have oxygen present in it. A skeletal muscle is also adaptable to other sources of energy, but it can do it without the oxygen present as well. So it doesn't really make a difference. So both of them are relatively flexible as far as the fuel for the energy goes, but cardiac muscle cells must have oxygen present to produce the energy from the fuel, but muscles can use either fermentation in the absence of oxygen or aerobic reaction in the presence of oxygen. So that's it from this PowerPoint. For the next PowerPoint, we are going to start discussing how the heart actually creates its pumping action using the 2 types of cells, which are your non-contractile cells, pacemaker cells, and creating depolarization effect that causes the action potential and muscle contraction in myocardium.